The rain didn't fall that night. It stabbed the pavement like it was angry, like it remembered what the people had chosen to forget. Streetlights flickered with the same nervous twitch as the eyes of those who walked beneath them. Shadows cast not just by buildings, but by history. Thick, crawling, suffocating. This was a city that polished its image with new condos and glass towers, while its foundation rotted with the sins of generations. Behind the murals of unity were bullet holes sealed with paint, not justice. Beneath the mayor's smile was a curdled silence, and through it all she moved, old bones wrapped in a worn coat, eyes like storm clouds that had seen too many promises soaked and drowned. Her name was Ruth Mallory, and she walked the same cracked sidewalk her mother had marched on 60 years ago, only now the signs had changed, but the stairs hadn't. She felt them, those glances that bounced off her like cold stones, the kind that didn't need to speak to say, "You don't belong here anymore." Her son, a man who had climbed the ranks of a crooked system to wear the badge at its peak, would not answer her calls tonight. Maybe he was in a meeting. Maybe he was ashamed. Or maybe deep down, he didn't want to remember where he came from either. Sirens whispered through the air like distant ghosts, and somewhere not far off, a decision was being made by a man with too much power and not enough conscience. The storm was not in the sky. It was in the soil, in the veins of this city, and something was about to crack. Ruth Mallory was not just an old woman. She was a pillar of memory in a city that had bulldozed every monument to truth that didn't fit its brochure. Her hands, weathered like river stone, once held the trembling fingers of neighbours bleeding from nightsticks and broken promises. She had survived curfews disguised as policies, men in uniforms who smiled as they shoved, and stares that sliced deeper than knives. But she stood through it all, tall in spirit if not in body. Now, though, the streets whispered with something colder, a respectless wind that saw her not as legacy, but as inconvenience. The corner store she once walked into with laughter now followed her with security cameras and silence. The children she taught to read now crossed to the other side of the street, ashamed or afraid to be seen walking beside history. Her son, Chief Kenneth Mallory, wore his badge like armor, but built his power on distance, not loyalty. When he spoke, he said "we" and meant them. His precinct, once a battleground of reform, now brimmed with rookies who mistook aggression for authority and color for threat. And Ruth, despite her son's title, was just another silhouette to them, black, elderly, and dismissible. On that day, the humiliation came not in a grand act, but in 1,000 small ones. At the bus stop, a white woman clutched her purse tighter and sneered. At the diner, the waitress forgot her coffee 3 times, but never forgot to smile at the man behind her. At the pharmacy, the young clerk called her sweetie, with the voice one uses for stray dogs. But Ruth never flinched. Her pride was silent, carved deep. It was when the patrol car slowed beside her that she knew the air had shifted. 2 officers inside. One young, one older, both white, both laughing at something she couldn't hear. The younger one pointed. The older one rolled down the window. "Everything all right, ma'am?" he asked, the word ma'am thick with mockery, as if it barely fit in his mouth. Ruth nodded once, kept walking. The car didn't move. Her phone rang. It was her son. She didn't answer. The city didn't just forget its roots. It uprooted them, spat on them, and paved over the hole. And Ruth Mallory was about to be reminded once more that in a city run by her own blood, her skin still spoke louder than any name. The sun had barely dipped beneath the rooftops when Ruth eased herself into the driver's seat of her aging Buick. The fabric of her coat tugged tight against the cracked leather. She had picked up a bag of groceries, too heavy for her arms, too light for the respect she still deserved. The parking lot of the local market, once a communal space where elders shared stories and laughter, now sat under the sterile glow of floodlights and silent suspicion. As she turned the key and the engine rattled to life, the red and blue lit up behind her like a silent ambush. No siren, no warning, just a car that appeared out of nowhere, blocking her path like a wall with wheels. She checked her mirrors. One officer, white, young, built like he learned everything he knew about policing from television and fear. He approached with a swagger not born from confidence but from the unspoken belief that he could do whatever he wanted, and someone above would call it procedural. Ruth rolled down the window halfway, her hands still on the wheel, voice calm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The way he looked at her, like she was a dog that had wandered too far from its yard, told her everything. "License and registration," he said. No explanation, no greeting, no decency. She reached slowly into her purse, but the moment her hand moved, his voice snapped. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Her heart skipped. She froze. "I'm getting my license," she said carefully. "I didn't ask for commentary," he spat back, the radio on his vest crackling with some distant code. Another cruiser pulled in behind him. Now there were two. She could see the second officer, older, stockier, chewing gum like he was bored, watching her with the dead gaze of someone who'd seen too much and learned too little. "Step out of the vehicle," the young one said. Ruth hesitated. "I've done nothing wrong." That was enough. He flung the door open himself, grabbed her arm with no more care than one might use on a discarded bag, and yanked her from the car. Her cane fell, clattering on the asphalt. Her knees buckled, but he didn't care. He shoved her against the hood, her face pressed to the cold metal. Groceries spilled, eggs broken like her dignity. "Resisting?" he asked loud enough for the body cam, for the parking lot, for the excuse he would later give. "This one's feisty." The older cop laughed. Someone in the distance filmed. No one intervened. Ruth didn't scream. She had learned long ago that screaming only fed the beast. But her eyes locked onto the camera lens like they were speaking to every viewer through time. No name dropped. No mention of her son. Just silence. Proud, defiant, furious silence. As the handcuffs clicked shut on wrists that had once rocked generations to sleep, the first spark lit the match. The city didn't know it yet, but it had just made its last mistake. Let's take a brief pause in the story. If you're still with us, let us know in the comments. Where are you listening from? And have you ever witnessed or experienced something that echoes what's unfolding here? Your voice matters. If this story speaks to you, make sure to follow so you don't miss what comes next. Now, we continue. By dawn, the footage had already circled the city twice. A shaky phone video, 48 seconds of raw, undeniable truth, made its way from one set of eyes to the next, like a virus of conscience. No narration, no edits. Just Ruth Mallory's body being pulled like furniture from her car, her cane tossed aside, her voice swallowed by the cold authority of a uniform. The silence in her resistance was louder than any scream, and that made it impossible to ignore. Local media called it alleged misconduct. Social media called it what it was, an attack. The internet didn't care that she was elderly. It didn't care about her decades of service to the community, the students she taught, the protests she survived, the food she gave to hungry neighbors. All it saw was a black woman on the ground and white officers standing over her, their posture casual, their authority untouched. The comments turned quickly. Some praised the officers. She should have complied. Don't resist. Don't get hurt. The camera doesn't show what happened before. Others saw deeper. That's someone's grandmother. Look how calm she was. They still treated her like a threat. They didn't even ask why she was there. But it was one comment that cut through the noise like a blade. That's the chief of police's mother. It spread like wildfire. Screenshots, confirmations, old photos of Ruth at her son's swearing-in ceremony, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with something close to pride. The city froze. Inside the downtown precinct, Chief Kenneth Mallory stood alone in his office. The video paused on his computer screen, his face pale, his jaw locked. He watched his mother being thrown to the pavement over and over again, unable to blink, unable to breathe. He didn't call the officers. He didn't issue a statement. Instead, he turned off the monitor and sat in silence, the weight of his badge suddenly heavier than ever. On the streets, protest signs began to reappear, pulled from closets, dusted off, updated with fresh ink and older rage. Reporters knocked on doors that had been silent for years. Neighbors began to talk again, not with fear, but with fire. Yet the system moved slowly, deliberately, as it always had. The officers were placed on administrative leave, the phrase as empty as the apology that followed. Meanwhile, Ruth lay in a hospital bed with bruises on her ribs and quiet in her throat. Her silence was not weakness. It was refusal. Refusal to play the part of victim, to soften the blow for the comfort of others. She had warned her son long ago. If you don't change the house from the inside, it will bury you with it. And now the walls were closing in. The son in the crossfire. Kenneth Mallory had always believed he was playing the long game. From a young age, he understood the brutal calculus of survival in a city divided by lines of race and class, even though those lines were invisible to the ones who didn't have to live on the wrong side of them. He'd watched his mother, the strong, proud Ruth Mallory, fight for every inch of dignity in a system that demanded she bleed for it. He knew what it cost her. He knew that his rise had been paved with the sacrifices of people like her, people who had been overlooked, who had been swept aside by an indifferent system, yet still clung to their pride. But Kenneth wasn't Ruth. He wasn't the one who stood outside in the cold, marching for change, even when it felt like there was no change to march for. No. Kenneth Mallory had made his peace with the system long ago. He had put on the badge, worn it proudly, and in return, he had been given a seat at the table. The table where decisions were made, decisions that could shape the lives of thousands, decisions that were all about control. It wasn't about justice anymore. It wasn't about fairness. It was about power. And power, he had learned, could only be maintained if you knew how to stay just far enough from the flames to avoid getting burned. But now, as he sat alone in his office, staring at the frozen image of his mother being pulled from her car, bruised and humiliated, Kenneth felt the weight of his choices settle on his chest like a 1,000-pound stone. His phone buzzed with notifications, calls from his mother's hospital room, messages from reporters, text after text from his colleagues, demanding answers, demanding control of the situation. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about containment. They cared about covering their backs. But none of that mattered now, because none of it could erase what had just happened. He ran a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble. There was no escape from this moment. Not anymore. It was always supposed to be different. Ruth had always told him that he had to fight from the inside, that change didn't come from the streets, from the marches, or the protests. It came from those who could make the decisions, who could rewrite the rules. And so he had. He had bent, twisted, and shaped his ambitions to fit into the structure of the department. He had done what was necessary to climb the ladder, and with each rung he ascended, the more distant he became from the very people who had raised him, his community, his roots, his mother. But the truth was that Kenneth had never really cared about the people in those neighborhoods, the ones who fought, who bled, who were constantly pushed to the margins. He cared about his own survival, and for a time, that was enough. But now everything had unraveled. Now, the reality was inescapable. His mother, the woman who had given him everything, the woman who had fought for a better world with every ounce of her being, was lying in a hospital bed, her body broken, her dignity shredded, because of him. There was no way around it. His blood, his flesh, his very identity had been used as a tool in the machinery that had crushed her. All the while, he had stood on the sidelines, too afraid to act, too afraid to make waves, too comfortable in his position. Kenneth's hands trembled as he picked up the phone and dialed the hospital. The line clicked, and a voice on the other end answered, low and monotone. "Chief Mallory," the voice said. "Your mother is stable, but she is requesting to speak with you. She's asking why you haven't come to see her." Kenneth's throat tightened. He couldn't speak. What could he possibly say to her? What words could make up for the fact that her son had been complicit in the system that had brutalized her? "I'll be there soon," he said, his voice distant and hollow. The call ended. The weight of the world settled over him once more. He stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the city below, the city that he had sworn to protect, the city that had broken his mother's body. He knew what was coming next. The protests would escalate. The media would hound him. His colleagues would turn their backs on him, some out of genuine fear, others out of sheer convenience. The system was already closing in, ready to isolate the problem, and the problem, he knew now, was him. And then there was his mother. Her silent judgment, her unwavering resolve. How could he ever face her again? The thought of walking into that sterile hospital room, facing the woman who had given him life, only to see the disappointment in her eyes, was almost too much to bear. But he had no choice. The drive to the hospital felt like an eternity. Every stoplight, every turn, every inch of road seemed to stretch out forever. Kenneth's mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, none of them clear. He had seen it all, the protests, the rallies, the outrage, but none of it had prepared him for this. None of it had prepared him for his mother, the woman who had been everything to him, the woman who had believed in him, to be broken by the very system he had worked so hard to protect. He arrived at the hospital in the dead of night. The lights in the hallway flickered above him, casting strange, uneven shadows. The air smelled of antiseptic and fear. He walked down the long corridor toward her room, each step heavier than the last. When he entered, his mother was sitting in the bed, her frail form propped up by pillows. The bruises on her face were deep and dark, like shadows clinging to the hollows of her skin. Her eyes, though, those eyes, they were the same eyes that had watched him grow up, the same eyes that had taught him right from wrong, the same eyes that had seen too much pain, too much injustice. But now they were empty, cold, dead. Kenneth stood in the doorway for a long moment, unsure of what to say. He had spent his entire life building walls, walls around his heart, walls around his beliefs, walls around his very identity. But now, standing before the woman who had shaped him, all those walls felt like they were crumbling to dust. Ruth didn't speak at first. She just stared at him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the boy she had raised somewhere in the man who stood before her. Finally, she spoke. "You were supposed to be different," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Kenneth flinched. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. I didn't know what to do," he stammered. "Mum, I didn't think it would go this far." "You didn't think?" she repeated, her voice cold, biting. "You didn't think, Kenneth? How many lives have you ruined? How many people have you allowed to be crushed beneath your badge?" Her words were like fire, scorching every defense he had ever built. He tried to speak, to explain, but no words came. "I taught you to fight for what's right," Ruth continued, her eyes narrowing with a pain that went deeper than any wound. "I taught you to stand up for people who don't have a voice. And you sold your soul for a title. You let them turn you into one of them." Kenneth's throat was tight, his chest heaving with the weight of everything he had ignored, everything he had allowed. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though even as he said it, he knew the words were hollow. Ruth's eyes softened just a little, but only for a moment. "Sorry isn't enough," she said, her voice heavy with the weight of everything that had led them here. "You've taken the life I worked my entire life to build and turned it into something unrecognizable." Kenneth didn't know what to say. His mother had given him everything, the strength to fight, the courage to stand up for what was right, but he had abandoned all of it in his pursuit of power. And now, in the quiet of this sterile room, he understood what his actions had cost. He had become everything he had once vowed to fight against. And now, he had no idea how to fix it. The city outside the hospital window felt distant, as though it belonged to someone else. Kenneth stood there, trapped between the person he used to be and the person he had become. He could hear the protests in the streets, the shouts of those who had once looked up to him as their protector. But now they would never see him the same way again. And neither would Ruth. The city had no mercy. By the time Kenneth Mallory left the sterile confines of the hospital, his world had already begun to collapse in slow motion. His mother's words, cold and piercing, echoed in his mind as he made his way back to his office, the weight of her judgment pressing down on him with every step. But as much as he wanted to fix it, to redeem himself, the reality was that he was already too deep in the system he had helped build, the system that had condemned his own blood to suffering. The news cycle, was relentless. His name, once a symbol of authority and progress, had become a symbol of hypocrisy. His face, previously admired, was now plastered across every screen, every headline, every conversation in the city. People were divided, as they always were. Some rallied behind him, some demanded his resignation, and some, the majority, simply wanted him to pay. The video of his mother being dragged from her car had gone viral. It wasn't just a clip anymore. It had become an emblem of everything wrong with the system. No one cared about the context, the justification, the hours of paperwork, or procedural protocol. They saw a black woman in pain, humiliated, disrespected, and they saw the man who had turned his back on her for the sake of power. Kenneth's phone rang constantly, but he didn't pick up. Each call felt like another chain pulling him further into a pit he couldn't climb out of. The only message that mattered was the one his mother had sent him in silence. "You are no better than the ones who hurt me." It wasn't the system that was broken. It was him. And for the first time, Kenneth Mallory realized that it had always been him. By the time he arrived at the precinct the next day, the tension in the air was palpable. Officers walked with their heads down, avoiding his gaze. They had been silent the day before, pretending to be under review, but now their silence was laced with something darker: fear. Fear that if they continued to stand by him, they would be dragged into the same maelstrom. Fear that if they spoke out, they too would be crushed beneath the weight of the scandal. Kenneth walked past them, his back stiff, his mind clouded. He needed answers. He needed to know how the system had allowed this to happen. How had they not seen it? How had they let this violence unfold under their very noses? He entered his office, the door slamming shut behind him with a force that startled even him. His deputy, a young officer named Greg Daniels, stood by his desk, his face tight with the kind of professionalism that bordered on fear. Kenneth barely looked at him as he waved him in, the flicker of a frown on his lips. "Sit down, Greg," he muttered, already beginning to sift through the growing pile of reports on his desk. Greg didn't sit immediately. His eyes lingered on the door, his body language hesitant. Kenneth knew that look. He had seen it 1,000 times. Officers who thought they could play both sides, who feared the fallout, but were too loyal to abandon ship. "How did this happen?" Kenneth asked, his voice strained as he stared down at the papers. "I don't know, Chief," Greg said, his voice uncertain. "I wasn't on the scene. I didn't see the whole thing go down, but I know the officers involved. They've been with us for years." Kenneth's eyes flashed. "Don't give me that. You know as well as I do that this isn't about them. It's about us, the system, our failure to protect her, to protect anyone." Greg shifted uncomfortably. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Kenneth stood up suddenly, his chair scraping harshly against the floor. "I want the full report on my desk by the end of the day. I want everything. The internal investigation, the body cam footage, the statements, every damn detail." "I'll get on it right away," Greg said, stepping back, clearly relieved to leave the room. Kenneth watched him go, the weight of his own failure dragging him deeper into his seat. He needed something more than just paperwork. He needed a solution. He needed something to show that he could still control the situation, that he could fix the broken pieces before they shattered beyond repair. But deep down, he knew it was too late for that. The wheels had already been set in motion, and the machine was moving faster than he could keep up with. His mother's words rang in his ears. "You've taken the life I worked my entire life to build, and turned it into something unrecognizable." Outside the precinct, the protests had begun. They were small at first, just a few dozen people chanting outside City Hall, demanding justice, holding signs with slogans that echoed what everyone had been saying for years: no justice, no peace. But the numbers grew. As the sun sank lower in the sky, more and more bodies poured into the streets. They were angry, they were tired, and they had been waiting for a moment like this to give their voices life again. The media covered it all, news helicopters hovering above, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions over the growing noise. The crowd grew louder, more aggressive. They were calling for Kenneth's resignation, demanding that the officers involved be fired, that the entire police department be overhauled. The rallying cries echoed through the city like thunder, a constant rhythmic beat that carried through every street. And somewhere, in the heart of the crowd, Ruth Mallory stood. Her face, still bruised from the assault, was now covered by a scarf. But her eyes burned with the same fire they had always held. She had always been a fighter, but now she wasn't fighting for a better world. She was fighting for herself, for her dignity, for the right to exist without fear. She had raised Kenneth to be something better, but now he was a part of the very system that had oppressed them both for years. She couldn't help him. Not anymore. And that thought, that realization, made her stomach twist with an unbearable pain. Kenneth's day dragged on. Every call, every meeting, every moment in the office felt like it was pulling him further into a pit of despair. There were no easy answers, no shortcuts to redemption. He had built his life on the idea that he could manipulate the system, that he could be above it all. But now he was drowning in it. He stared at his reflection in the glass window that overlooked the city below. The streets were alive with chaos now. The police had deployed officers in riot gear to contain the crowds, but it was a futile effort. The anger was too big to be contained. The pain was too deep. And no amount of force could suppress the truth that was rising in the hearts of the people. Kenneth knew this wasn't just about his mother anymore. It wasn't just about the officers involved. This was about everything. The years of neglect, the systems of oppression that had bled this city dry, the power structures that had allowed it all to continue. And now, it was too late to pretend he didn't know. Too late to hide behind the badge. He turned away from the window, his hands trembling as he reached for the phone. There was only one thing left to do. He needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. He needed to meet the people who had been affected by all of this, the victims, the protesters, his own community. He needed to understand the full extent of the damage, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. No amount of apology, no amount of explanation could ever undo the years of harm that had been done. And so, Kenneth Mallory made his decision. He would step down, but it wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough. And in the heart of the city, Ruth Mallory stood with her fists clenched, watching the world she had fought for crumble around her. The battle wasn't over yet, and it wouldn't end until everything that had been broken was finally put back together, piece by shattered piece. The city had become a pressure cooker, steam rising, anger bubbling, and there was nothing to release the pressure. The streets were alive with voices, with fury, with a deep and palpable sense of betrayal. Ruth Mallory's name echoed through the air like a battle cry. The woman who had been violated, humiliated, dragged across the pavement by the men who were supposed to serve and protect. Her suffering had ignited a fire in the hearts of the community. Black and brown people, old and young, the forgotten and the oppressed. They had been silent for far too long, but Ruth had become their voice, and the city had to listen. But the machine that Kenneth Mallory had worked so hard to be a part of, one that promised order, control, and strength, was starting to fracture. And even though he had taken the first step to resign, even though he had felt the weight of his choices, the world outside his office refused to let him off the hook. The protests outside the precinct had grown into something bigger than any one man. They were no longer about his resignation. They were about the system itself, its abuse, its corruption, its insidiousness. The people wanted blood. They wanted change. And the kind of change that would break the system could never come quietly. The truth was, Kenneth didn't just fear the mob outside. He feared what it meant, what it said about everything he had ever believed in. The streets were filled with people who had come to see him, not as the man who had worked his way up from the bottom, but as a cog in a machine that had perpetuated their pain. For the first time, he realized he wasn't part of a solution. He had been part of the problem all along, and that realization made him furious. Kenneth wasn't a man who liked to feel powerless. He wasn't a man who liked to be cornered. But that was exactly what the world had done to him. The media, the protests, the angry citizens who stood outside his precinct every day, demanding justice. They had stripped him of his armor. They had exposed the weak underbelly of the empire he had spent his entire career building. And now, Kenneth was faced with the undeniable truth. He had become one of them. The officers in the precinct treated him differently now. There was no longer any respect in their eyes, no longer any camaraderie. He had fallen from grace, and there was no going back. His colleagues avoided him, whispering behind his back, unwilling to face him directly. They no longer saw the chief of police, the man who had once been their leader, their shield. Now, all they saw was a man who had failed them. A man who had allowed the very thing they had sworn to fight against to flourish under his watch. But in all of this, there was one officer who was different. Officer Samuels, a former street cop with a reputation for being ruthless, a man whose allegiance to the badge was unwavering, approached Kenneth's office late one night, his footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Kenneth had no choice but to let him in. "Chief," Samuels began, his voice rough, his eyes cold. "You've made a mistake, and now the city is coming for you." Kenneth looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and defiance. He had expected this moment, but it didn't make it any easier to hear. "Tell me something I don't know, Samuels," Kenneth replied, his voice tight with frustration. Samuels stepped further into the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "This isn't just about your mother anymore. This is about us, about the entire system. You've been the face of it for too long, and now they're coming for everything we built, everything we've worked for, and it's too late to stop them." Kenneth looked at the officer, his mind racing. "You don't get it. I didn't want this. I didn't ask for it." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the weight of guilt and anger in his chest. "But it's too late. The city is burning. The world is burning. And nothing I do will make it stop." "You're right," Samuels replied coldly. "Nothing you do will make it stop. But you're still the chief, and you still have power. You just need to make a choice. You can either let them tear us apart, or you can do what needs to be done to survive. We don't owe them anything, Chief. They've never cared about us. It's time to remind them who holds the real power." Kenneth stared at the officer for a long moment, processing the words, feeling the weight of them settle deep in his chest. Samuels was right in one way. The world outside the walls of the precinct had already turned against him. But the real question was, how far was he willing to go to reclaim control? Was he still the man he had once been? The man who believed in protecting the system? Or had he truly become something else? Someone who could no longer walk the line between what was right and what was necessary? That night, the city boiled over. The protests outside the precinct had reached a fever pitch. People filled the streets shouting for justice, demanding accountability, marching as if they had nothing left to lose. There was an energy in the air, raw, visceral, and unstoppable. The media covered it all. News helicopters hovering above, cameras flashing as reporters shouted questions over the growing noise. The crowd grew louder, more aggressive. They were calling for Kenneth's resignation, demanding that the officers involved be fired, that the entire police department be overhauled. The rallying cries echoed through the city like thunder, a constant, rhythmic beat that carried through every street. And somewhere, in the heart of the crowd, Ruth Mallory stood. Her face, still bruised from the assault, was now covered by a scarf. But her eyes burned with the same fire they had always held. She had always been a fighter, but now she wasn't fighting for a better world. She was fighting for herself, for her dignity, for the right to exist without fear. She had raised Kenneth to be better, but now he was a part of the very system that had oppressed them both for years. She couldn't help him, not anymore. And that thought, that realization, made her stomach twist with an unbearable pain. Kenneth's day dragged on. Every call, every meeting, every moment in the office felt like it was pulling him further into a pit of despair. There were no easy answers, no shortcuts to redemption. He had built his life on the idea that he could manipulate the system, that he could be above it all. But now he was drowning in it. He stared at his reflection in the glass window that overlooked the city below. The streets were alive with chaos now. The police had deployed officers in riot gear to contain the crowds, but it was a futile effort. The anger was too big to be contained. The pain was too deep. And no amount of force could suppress the truth that was rising in the hearts of the people. Kenneth knew this wasn't just about his mother anymore. It wasn't just about the officers involved. This was about everything. The years of neglect, the systems of oppression that had bled this city dry, the power structures that had allowed it all to continue. And now, it was too late to pretend he didn't know. Too late to hide behind the badge. He turned away from the window, his hands trembling as he reached for the phone. There was only one thing left to do. He needed to confront the truth, no matter how painful it was. He needed to meet the people who had been affected by all of this, the victims, the protesters, his own community. He needed to understand the full extent of the damage, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't matter. No amount of apology, no amount of explanation could ever undo the years of harm that had been done. And so, Kenneth Mallory made his decision. He would step down. But it wouldn't be enough. Nothing would be enough. And in the heart of the city, Ruth Mallory stood with her fists clenched, watching the world she had fought for crumble around her. The battle wasn't over yet, and it wouldn't end until everything that had been broken was finally put back together. Piece by shattered piece. Kenneth Mallory had never felt the world shift so dramatically. The next few days bled into each other, indistinguishable, as the city continued its spiral toward chaos. The protests outside the precinct had morphed into a volatile blend of rage and hope, a city on the brink, demanding answers and demanding change. They were no longer simply voices shouting into the void. They had become a reckoning, a judgment that stretched far beyond one man's failure, far beyond one incident. It was a reckoning with a system that had suffocated its people for too long, a system that Kenneth had served so diligently, so blindly, until it had turned its ugly face on the very people he was supposed to protect. And now, it was coming for him. In the days following his resignation, Kenneth had become a ghost, his name a curse that people spat in their anger. His office had been emptied out by those who once served him, and now his badge was nothing more than a relic, a symbol of everything wrong with the power he had once wielded. The city had made its choice, and Kenneth had been discarded like so much trash. No longer a symbol of authority, but a reminder of the corruption that festered in the heart of every institution that claimed to protect. But that wasn't what stung the most. What stung the most was the betrayal, the deep, unrelenting shame that burned inside of him when he thought of Ruth. His mother, the woman who had fought so hard for him, who had raised him to be better than this, only to watch him fall into the same cycle of cruelty, of silence, of complicity. She had been right. She had always been right. And now, as he sat alone in the small, empty apartment he had retreated to, Kenneth couldn't escape the image of her bruised face, the pain in her eyes that had no words to describe it. She was a casualty of a system that had been built to chew up people like her and spit them out. And now, he was part of that system, now left to wander in the wake of its destruction, with no idea how to fix what had been broken. He couldn't hide from it anymore. The world had turned on him, and he deserved every second of it. But it wasn't just the world outside that had turned its back. Inside, Kenneth was crumbling. The shame, the guilt, the self-loathing had eaten away at him like a slow, festering wound, and there was no amount of self-reflection, no amount of apology that could heal it. He had failed. And nothing, not the protests, not the calls for justice, not the people standing outside demanding accountability, would ever erase that. It was in that darkness, that isolation, that Kenneth received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end was cold, calculating, familiar. "You've made your bed, Mallory," the voice said, without greeting, without preamble. "And now you're going to lie in it." Kenneth's stomach twisted. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to understand something," the voice continued. "The system isn't going to let you go. Not like this. They'll bury you under the weight of it all, and when they're done with you, they'll forget you ever existed. The people out there." The voice chuckled darkly. "They think they're going to change things, but the truth is, they're just pawns in a game they don't understand. And you're no different. You've been played, just like everyone else." Kenneth's heart pounded. He recognized the voice now. It was someone from his past, someone who had always been a shadow in the corners of his life, a reminder that the system could always manipulate and control. "What do you want from me?" Kenneth repeated. this time more forcefully, though his words felt weak, empty. "What you can't do alone," the voice said. "You're not going to get away from this mess by walking away, Mallory. You've got one choice left. Use your position for what it's really worth, or watch everything you've built burn down around you. If you think the system is done with you, you're mistaken. It's just beginning." The call ended abruptly, leaving Kenneth in the quiet, staring at the phone in his hand. For the first time, he felt a flicker of the old power that had once consumed him. But it was hollow, a dead ember, with nothing left to fuel it but his own desperation. He didn't know what game the voice was playing, but he knew one thing: his past was catching up with him, and no amount of self-reflection would erase it. The system he had been a part of was a beast, and now it was coming for him. And as much as he wanted to fight back, he didn't know if he had the strength left to face it. The city outside was burning, and Kenneth Mallory was trapped in the flames, watching everything he had ever known go up in smoke. As the protests reached their peak, the city became unrecognizable. The anger was no longer just about the officers who had assaulted Ruth Mallory. It was about everything. The history of racism, the brutality of the police, the years of oppression that had been ignored, swept under the rug, and kept out of sight. The system, which had once claimed to be the protector of the people, had shown its true face, and the people were done with it. The protests were no longer peaceful demonstrations. They had become riots. The anger was palpable, and with every brick thrown, every building set on fire, the walls of the city seemed to crumble. Kenneth had expected the protests to fizzle out, to fade into the background once the initial shock had worn off, but he was wrong. The people were unrelenting, and their fury was growing. He had failed them all, and they had no intention of letting him or the system he represented walk away unscathed. The protests outside the police station grew more intense by the day. They were no longer just voices of dissent. They were a force, a flood of rage that washed through the city, leaving destruction in its wake. The people had turned their anger on the system, and now it was Kenneth's turn to face the consequences of his complicity. There were calls for justice, demands for accountability, and with every passing hour, the city grew more divided. People were losing their faith in everything that had once held them together. The police were on high alert, their presence in the streets more pronounced than ever before, but no amount of force could quell the rising tide of rage. Kenneth was no longer a part of the city he had sworn to protect. He was an enemy, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, and now the people wanted him gone. But even as the city burned, even as the protests escalated, Kenneth found himself standing at a crossroads. There was no way out. There was no easy answer. The system that had raised him had failed, and now it was time for him to face the truth. He was no longer in control. The world he had known was collapsing, and all he could do was watch it burn. But in that moment, as the chaos unfolded outside his window, he realized something that would change everything. The system hadn't just broken him, it had broken everyone. And if there was any hope for rebuilding what had been destroyed, it would have to come from the ashes. The city had descended into chaos. But amidst the turmoil, there was something else beginning to stir. A quiet, dangerous undercurrent that nobody seemed to notice, or perhaps chose to ignore. The protests outside the police precinct had grown exponentially, their fervour not just sustained but escalating. The air was thick with anger, with the desperate desire for retribution, for change, and for a reckoning that had been a long time coming. People were tired of the lies, tired of the systems that had broken them, tired of the blood that had been spilled in the name of law and order. But no one knew how close they were to the edge, how fragile the balance had become. Kenneth Mallory had seen the protests. He had watched them unfold from the comfort of his dimly lit apartment, where he now sat, unable to face the world that had turned its back on him. The weight of his guilt was suffocating, but it was not just the guilt of what he had done. It was the suffocating realization that his entire life had been a lie, that the very system he had fought to protect was the same system that had allowed people like his mother to suffer. Ruth Mallory had been the one person who had always believed in him, who had raised him to be better, to rise above the system. And now she was gone, broken by the very thing he had been complicit in. But no matter how much he replayed the events in his mind, no matter how many times he told himself that he had no choice, that he had been trying to make change from within, Kenneth couldn't escape the truth. He had failed. He had betrayed her. He had betrayed everyone. And the city was coming for him. It wasn't just the protest that he feared. It was what came next. The very system he had helped to build was about to collapse, and Kenneth, for all his ambition, had never imagined that the day would come when he would be caught in the middle of it. His phone buzzed again, the screen flashing with an unfamiliar number. Hesitant, he picked it up. "Mallory," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're still alive," a voice on the other end said, dry and laced with disdain. Kenneth's pulse quickened. "What do you want?" "To see you burn," the voice replied. "But that's not going to happen unless you make a choice, Mallory. You've been hiding, but the truth is, you can't hide forever. The city knows what you've done. They know who you are. And they're coming for you. All of you." The words hit Kenneth like a punch to the gut. He felt his breath catch in his chest. "What do you mean?" he asked. But the voice had already hung up. There was no answer, just the cold emptiness of a dead line. He stared at the phone, his hands trembling. The city was no longer just angry. It was hunting. It was gathering its strength, ready to tear down everything in its path. Kenneth could feel the walls closing in. The police, the media, the community, it was all collapsing around him. He had been a part of this system, and now the very thing he had fought to protect was coming for him, hungry and unforgiving. He thought of his mother again, of the way her body had been dragged across the pavement, her dignity stripped from her in the name of control. That image was burned into his mind, and it haunted him in a way nothing else could. He had been a part of that violence. He had been the one who had let it happen. And now, as the world around him crumbled, Kenneth Mallory could only wonder if there would ever be a way to fix it. Would there be a way to erase the sins of the past? Or was he simply too far gone to be saved? As he sat there in the darkness of his apartment, the distant sounds of the protests outside growing louder, he made a decision. It was time to confront the truth, no matter how painful. It was time to face the people. He stood up, walking to the window, his eyes scanning the streets below. The protesters had gathered in force, their chants now a constant hum that filled the night air. The city had become a battlefield, and Kenneth Mallory was caught in the middle. He had tried to hide, to retreat into the shadows, but he knew that there was no escaping what was coming. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, the anger, the hatred, the desire for justice that would not be denied. It was coming for him. It was coming for all of them. But Kenneth Mallory had one final decision to make. Would he hide from the truth? Or would he step into the fire and face what he had done? There was no easy way out, no way to undo the damage. But as he stared at the chaos unfolding below, something inside him shifted. He couldn't fix the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could make a stand. And that stand would come with a cost. The city would never forgive him. The people would never forget what he had done. But if there was any chance for redemption, it would start here, with the truth. As the sun began to rise over the city, casting long shadows over the streets, Kenneth Mallory took a deep breath and made his way toward the door. The world outside was waiting for him. The world that had once been his to control was now beyond his reach. But it didn't matter anymore. He was going to face it, head on. He would face the people he had failed. He would face the consequences of his actions. And he would face himself in a way he never had before. The battle wasn't over yet. The city was still on the edge, still burning with the fire of injustice. But Kenneth Mallory had decided. He was going to burn with it. And whatever came next, he would face it on his own terms. As he stepped out into the chaos, the sounds of the protesters growing louder, he realized one thing. This wasn't just about him. This was about everything. The broken system, the broken promises, the people who had been left behind. The fire of change had been ignited, and now it was going to consume them all. It was time for the reckoning to begin. The city had been waiting for it. And so had he. The sun had barely risen, yet the air was already thick with tension. The streets of the city were still smouldering from the night before. The sounds of shattered glass, the crackling of fires, and the rhythmic thump of distant chants filled the morning. The protests hadn't died down. They had evolved into something bigger, something louder, something unstoppable. And Kenneth Mallory, the man who had once been the face of the police force, stood at the epicenter of it all, knowing there was no escaping the storm he had helped create. Kenneth had always been a man of power, a man who could make the decisions, who could move the pieces of the game around the board and control the outcome. Or so he had thought. He had been so blinded by ambition, by the need to prove that he could rise above his origins, that he had failed to see the cracks in the foundation, the corruption that festered beneath the polished surface. And now, as he stood at the precipice of everything he had built, Kenneth realized that it had all been an illusion. The power, the respect, the career he had fought so hard for, it was all gone, reduced to rubble by a single mistake, a single moment of brutality that had shattered everything he had ever known. The crowd outside the precinct had grown so large that it felt like the city itself was alive, breathing in a single unified exhale. The air was thick with rage, but also something else. A sense of righteousness, of justice finally being demanded, long after it had been denied. For too long, the people had been told to be silent. For too long, they had been told that their pain didn't matter. For too long, the voices of the oppressed had been drowned out by the cacophony of power, of privilege. But now, that power was crumbling, and the people were rising. Kenneth had seen it. The people he had once served, now united in their fury, now demanding justice, demanding accountability for the system that had crushed them. He had betrayed them all, and he knew it. The media had painted him as the villain. The police had turned their backs on him, watching from the shadows, waiting for him to take the fall. But Kenneth wasn't stupid. He knew who had the real power in this city. He knew that the system was built on the backs of people like Ruth, people like the protesters outside, people who had been crushed, ignored, erased. He had never truly understood the weight of it until now, until his own mother had been dragged through the streets, humiliated by the very system he had sworn to uphold. He had betrayed her, and he had betrayed everyone who had ever believed that the system could be fixed from within. He had failed, and now there was no running, no more excuses, no more hiding behind the badge, behind the walls of the precinct, behind the lies he had told himself for so long. There was only the truth, and it was staring him in the face, as clear as the bruises on his mother's body, as clear as the rage that burned in the eyes of the people demanding justice. The world had turned on him, and he couldn't blame them. Kenneth stepped out into the streets, his heart pounding in his chest. The moment his feet hit the pavement, the crowd went silent. Every eye turned to him, and for the first time, Kenneth felt the weight of the city's gaze. It was not the gaze of power. It was not the gaze of respect. It was the gaze of judgment, the gaze of a people who had been wronged, who had suffered, who had been beaten and broken and silenced for far too long. And they were done. The silence stretched on, unbearable. Kenneth could hear his heart beating in his ears. He didn't know what to do, didn't know what to say. For the first time in his life, he was powerless. He had been stripped of everything, the badge, the title, the respect. He had nothing left but the truth. But what could he say? What words could possibly undo the damage? What could he offer to a mother who had been humiliated, to a city that had been burned and broken by the very system he had upheld? How could he explain that he hadn't known, hadn't seen what was right in front of him? How could he apologize for a lifetime of complicity? The crowd started to murmur, then growl, and soon the chant was unmistakable. Justice for Ruth! Justice for Ruth! The words cut through him like a blade. He could feel them in his bones, in his soul, cutting away the last remnants of pride he had left. He had failed her. He had failed them all. And now the reckoning had come. The people began to move forward, slowly at first, their steps measured, purposeful. Kenneth's body tensed, the hairs on the back of his neck rising. He had spent his life trying to control situations like this, trying to command respect, trying to suppress the anger that had always simmered just beneath the surface. But now, he was powerless. The people didn't fear him anymore. They didn't need to. They had already won. Kenneth's knees buckled. His breath was shallow, his vision clouded by tears he couldn't hold back. He felt his body tremble as the first stone hit the ground in front of him, its sharp sound echoing in the tense air. Another stone, and then another. The rage of the crowd had no direction but forward, and as the stones continued to rain down, Kenneth felt himself fall to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of his own guilt, by the truth that had come too late to save him. The crowd was no longer just chanting. They were moving, forcing him backward, until he could feel the cold concrete of the precinct building against his back. He closed his eyes, waiting for the inevitable, the humiliation, the punishment. But it didn't come. Instead, something else did, a hand. He opened his eyes to see a figure standing before him, a tall, strong presence. It was Ruth. Her bruised face was no longer covered by a scarf, and though her eyes were filled with pain, they were also filled with something else, something that could not be broken. Her hand reached out to him, not in anger, but in forgiveness. And in that moment, something shifted in Kenneth's soul. He had failed her. He had failed them all. But in this moment, with his mother standing before him, he realized that the reckoning wasn't just about paying for his sins. It was about finally understanding the pain, the truth that had been there all along. Ruth didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than any words could have been, and for the first time, Kenneth Mallory felt the weight of his past lift off his shoulders, if only for a moment. The crowd did not advance. The stones stopped falling. The silence between them all was deafening. The reckoning had come. The people had spoken. And as the sun set on that city, broken but hopeful, Kenneth Mallory knew that this would be the last time he would ever stand in the shadow of the system that had destroyed everything he had ever known. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't the enemy. He wasn't the judge. He wasn't the executioner. He was just a man, standing in the light of truth. We would love to hear what you think about this story. What were your thoughts on the journey of Kenneth Mallory and the events that unfolded? Have you ever encountered or witnessed racism in your own life? Your insights and stories are incredibly important to us, and we value every single one of you who engages with our content. Your support means more than words can express. If you enjoyed the story, please consider subscribing and leaving a like to let us know. We appreciate you taking the time to listen. Have a wonderful day ahead. To show us that you've listened all the way through, leave a comment with the phrase, "Justice is a long road, but it's worth the fight."